Thanks very much. And thanks all for sticking around. I know you guys are very busy, so I do appreciate your time. Unfortunately, I don't have any prizes, although, hopefully you can leave the session with some interesting information about, some of the experiences that we've had in British Columbia. Before I start, I really would like to thank the organizers of India Joy for inviting us to come over. It's been a really excellent experience. And also the representatives of the British Columbia Trade Office, who've also been working very hard to provide information and market entry for our companies as we've come to look at India. It's obviously a very vibrant and rapidly emerging market, and we're very happy to be here with you this week. But before I start, just a little bit about me. Been in the video games industry for about 20 years now, mainly working in technology, so a lot of infrastructure, a lot of platform, but also had some experiences with content. Currently mainly focused on the role of Chief Strategy Officer at AMP Technologies, and I'll give you a little bit more information about that shortly. But I'm also on the board at DGBC, and DGBC is the Interactive and Digital Media Industry Association in British Columbia, Canada. In many ways, we're kind of like the counterpart for Tevaga here in Telangana. And I also have a consulting company called Greenstone Initiatives, and Greenstone does a lot of work consulting with content companies, with blockchain companies, quite a lot of future tech companies as well. And for what it's worth, I'm actually originally from the UK. So even though I'm here sort of on behalf of BC and Canada, I actually only became Canadian at the beginning of November. And so anybody else who's interested in looking at maybe immigrating to Canada or the process that's involved there, please feel free to come and talk to me about that afterwards. So I'm a very new Canadian as well. So a little bit about AMPD. As I said, we're a company that really focuses on high-performance computing and cloud. If you're in multiplayer gaming or animation rendering or any of those kinds of industries, you'll know that current cloud providers, so for example, Amazon Web Services or Microsoft Azure, what we would call commodity cloud, doesn't really work when it comes to things like low latency applications. So what we're doing at AMPD is we're creating a kind of hybrid bare metal public and private cloud solution that's really designed to work very well and very specifically with low latency applications, obviously including things like esports, which are very twitchy, but also recently with mixed reality technologies, with a lot of machine learning, basically anything that needs a high performance compute environment, those companies should be talking to AMPD. One of the very sort of cool things about what we do here, you can see a picture of one of the data centers that we have in Vancouver. So a few years ago when I first moved to Vancouver, I used to stand on the sidelines on January, very cold winter mornings, watching my 7-year-old son play soccer. And one of the other dads happened to be a real estate developer. And so we've actually partnered with him for the past few years. And this data center is in the basement of one of his urban residential condos. And what we do is we take the heat that the servers produce, and we capture it and we compress it, and we actually use that heat to do the central heating within the residential building around the data center. And the other thing that we can do, again, if you know data centers, and if you get water in your air conditioning, typically it means it's broken. So what we decided to do was actually intentionally break the air conditioning systems, and so the data center can produce clean drinking water as well. And right now we actually use the water to do the water feature in front of the building, but obviously there are other applications there as well. So what we wanted to do was take a green and more sustainable approach to data centers, but obviously having the data center right there in the city also means that the gamers or whoever's using the data center around us isn't suffering from that challenge of speed of light where you need to connect hundreds and hundreds of miles away to a cloud location somewhere else, right? So that's what we're doing. Now, obviously, expanding this business around North America is going to take a lot of capital. So as a result of that, we kind of decided that the right funding and financing structure for this business was to take it public. So we spent the summer getting ready and then took the company public on the Canadian Stock Exchange. October 24th, we actually listed. And, touch wood, that seems to be going pretty well. Next, a little bit about DGBC. As I said, I'm on the board, and we are kind of the British Columbia equivalent of the Tevaga Association. So we look after video games companies, we look after animation and visual effects companies, and more recently, a lot of mixed reality companies as well. I guess, different from, say, a regular technology association, if you have a chief creative officer and you have a chief technology officer, and you blend those two things together, that pretty much means that in BC you're going to be wanting to be a member of DGBC. We also are a parent organization to the Animation and Visual Effects Alliance, which came together recently. So as I said, really, we kind of really do share that similar sort of outlook as an industry association to Tavaga. And over the last few days, we've really been talking with a number of the representatives of Tavaga about how we can work more closely. And so a little bit about BC itself. So I think most people are familiar with Vancouver. Obviously, you know, very beautiful place there. You can see Vancouver. But what a lot of people don't necessarily know is that we've actually had a video games cluster in British Columbia, in Vancouver, for about 40 years now. In fact, the Canadian games industry started in BC back in 1982. And a couple of kids who at the time I think were about 16 or 17 years old. So one of them called Don Matrick, one of them called Jeff Sember, had a game called Evolution, and took that game to a guy called Tony Williams, who's actually the father of my co-founder back at my mobile game studio, which was called Roadhouse. And so they published that game, and that company, Distinctive Software, was the company that Electronic Arts acquired in 1991. And now you can see the Electronic Arts campus, the Burnaby campus over there on that slide. And EA grew now to hire about, or employ about 2,000 people in British Columbia. And really, you know, you can kind of stem the Canadian games industry back to that moment back in 1982. So we're also actually the second or third, depending on who you ask, animation and visual effects cluster in the world. And you know, since then, we've also seen a lot of innovation develop within the province as a result of having this really strong video games cluster. So actually, what I want to talk about is how that history of video game development has really sort of driven forward this sense of innovation and the ability for us to move into other areas. So the key topic of what I do want to talk about, and it was interesting to hear the last speaker talk very, eloquently about how play is important in terms of creating sort of a mindset and how we can use games for other things. This is actually more about how the cluster of video games companies is really important when it comes to driving forward an innovation culture. So you can see here, for example, that our Minister of Innovation, Science and Technology, Navdeep Bains there, quite regularly tweets, and you can see a tweet here where he said that video game companies are at the heart of an innovation ecosystem. And, you know, I actually believe, maybe a little sort of more contentiously, that it's really very difficult to have a true innovation culture unless you support, you know, a really strong video games culture. And so that's kind of the bold statement that I want to start with. And I think that jurisdictions that don't, you know, look after their video games industry are at a disadvantage when it comes to innovation. Now, you know, it's been very positive seeing what's going on here in Telangana, because I think, you know, there's a lot of forward-looking, very visionary thinking going on, and obviously the province is supporting the video games industry very strongly. And I think that really is very necessary as you go forward. So as I said, what I'm not really talking about, particularly today, is, you know, the benefits for gamers, or the benefits of games when it comes to things like education, or the benefits of games themselves. Now, obviously, a lot of people who work in the games industry are gamers, and so it's inevitable that we're going to touch a little bit on some of those components. But you know, you can see here that Forbes back in 2018 did this survey to say that, you know, a great deal, a huge number of gamers actually do, you know, benefit from the games themselves. So, you know, 89% believing that gaming is beneficial to society, 44% associate their gaming with emotional well-being. Yeah, and so, you know, there you can see as well that there's a lot of studies about how actually playing video games, and as the last speaker would attest, you know, can actually create for a better adjusted, more well-educated population. But I'm not really wanting to talk about that today. What I do want to talk about is why governments and jurisdictions should care about developing and nurturing and really fostering that vibrant games culture and a vibrant games cluster, and how that really does underpin this innovation, the ability to create a broad innovation ecosystem. And as I said, we've been lucky enough to meet with Mr. Jayesh Rajan recently and hear about his plans here in Telangana. And you know, I think it's really important that jurisdictions that do have this vision around the video games cluster stick together and support each other. So our learnings from British Columbia over the last 30, 40 years, willing and very honored to actually be able to share some of those learnings with you guys as, Tavaga and Telangana look at creating this video games ecosystem. Obviously, why is this important then? So there was a study that the Boston Consulting Group did a few years ago where they reviewed more than 240 interventions in around 20 markets, where governments had really spent a lot of time, with a combination of tax incentives, trying to reduce barriers to entry for foreign professionals, promotion of the ecosystem. And what they really found here, this is a great report actually, they found that, a lot of jurisdictions that adopted these types of approaches really, really did experience massive growth in those sectors compared with overall growth. So for example, in the United Kingdom, this study shows that basically the creative technology industry was growing at well over double the rate of the regular economy, right? And here you can see very recently, actually, I've sort of been adjusting these slides as the week's been going on. This was a news item that came out just a few days ago about how the German government, for example, has now decided to fund its games development clusters to the tune of about 50 million euros. So, why is this? Obviously, there's some very interesting sort of practical reasons. So the games industry obviously continues to rocket in terms of its global growth. We have very high paying jobs. Again, at least in terms of the data from British Columbia, our average wage in the video games industry in BC is double that of the provincial average. And I think we see that sort of tending to be a trend around the world. Obviously, as a global marketplace, if you have a hit game, it can be a hit game globally, and that means a lot of revenue starts to flow into that ecosystem from elsewhere, right? So you're not really only just sort of recycling money; you're actually bringing value into your market. But I think the main point of what I want to talk about today is how the mentality of the gamer, the attitude and aptitude of people who want to work in games, really underpins what this guy Klaus Schwab, who is the founder and executive chairman of the World Economic Forum, said. And so what he said was that the leaders of the fourth industrial revolution, which is really the next sort of iteration of work and the next iteration of industry, are going to be driven. So this innovation is going to be driven by cultural technologists, which is individuals and companies who really know how to span and blend together the elements of creativity and technology. So in order to be able to succeed and lead in this next sort of era, I guess, of the development of the world, what we really need to do is be able to have people who are very familiar and comfortable with disruptive technologies. And what that's going to do is really change the nature of work and the skills required for the future in general, right? So, learning something is one thing, but actually learning how to learn, learning how to fail, learning how to do all of these different things are very, very important. So as a result of that, again, my sort of theory here, or what I'm trying to say, is that video games companies represent the best breeding ground for creating these types of team members, team leaders, and actually beyond that, company founders and company leaders as well. And that's due to a really unique sort of combination of skill sets that I think, we tend to want to nurture within video games that aren't really developed in many other industries, right? And so that's really this unique combination, I think, of technology and creativity, being able to create that creative technologist that we're going to need for the future, but also, the attitude and aptitude of, people who work within the industry and the types of companies that we put together. So, really what I'm trying to say here is that we need to be really very proud of being video game developers, because really without us and really without this strong video game cluster, a lot of these things would tend not to be developed quite as quickly or in the same way. So I want to give you a few examples of that. So the first one that I find really interesting, in fact, I'm going to talk about Elon Musk a couple of times in this presentation, but here you can see that Elon Musk is saying that, he actually hires a lot of the best software engineers for SpaceX out of the games industry, because there's a lot of people who are doing engineering in games. And I think it's always been the case that games have been on the forefront of a lot of technological developments. So what he's saying here is that, compared to the algorithms involved in creating a massively multiplayer online game, actually docking two spacecraft is really rather simple, right? So I think that's kind of cool. So from the perspective of technology and the solving of complex problems, and doing it in a way that's entertaining, that's actually really very, very difficult to do. And, when people sort of say, video games, there's trivial elements to them. Well, no, not really, because, as an industry, we've always been at the forefront of trying to solve these very difficult technological problems and doing it in an interesting way. So to go back to Vancouver for a little bit, and here is a very specific example of of how the technology that we developed as video game developers, and having had that 30, 40 years of video games culture, we were able here to really very quickly establish, I think, probably the world's leading mixed reality hub. If you look at Vancouver now, we have hundreds of mixed reality companies. And the reasons for that, so there's a couple of quotes here. So Bill Tam, who was the head of the BC Tech Association and now actually runs the Digital Technology Supercluster, headquartered in British Columbia. And the Supercluster project was the federal government in Canada deciding to kind of simplify and amalgamate a lot of the federal innovation funding into $1 billion. So basically the government decided to award $1 billion across 5 different supercluster projects. So BC won the Digital Technology Supercluster, and I think what Bill's saying there is that it's really the fact that we have this considerable experience in combining creativity and technology that opened up that opportunity in mixed reality. And obviously, as we all know, mixed reality isn't just an entertainment sector. In fact, it's probably less an entertainment sector than it is commercial enterprise right now. And obviously, we're hoping that mixed reality will come into the video games industry over the next few years. But right now we've had this opportunity emerge in BC because of the background that we've got in video games. And I think that sentiment there, as you can see, echoed by Edo DeMartin, who is the guy that's running the Microsoft Excellence Center in Vancouver. So the same thing. Basically, we've leveraged the abundant video game talent in Vancouver to work on the Microsoft HoloLens project. And that project alone, the Microsoft Canada Excellence Center, brings about $180 million of annual value to the BC economy. And, again, that's a really strict example there, a straight example there of how I think the fact that we had this very strong video games background has led to the ability for us to move into these future issues. And in fact, here you can see that's a very, very small selection of the number of companies in Vancouver that are now focused on things like e-learning and education, manufacturing, healthcare, which were all started by guys who, I think actually in most cases, they probably were graduates or alumni of Electronic Arts, never mind the video games industry more broadly. So the effect of having, really strong video game, anchor tenant like EA really can't be underestimated in the amount of benefit that it has across the board. Also, I think another thing to say is just the value of video games and the way that we are developing new technologies and new ways of thinking about things in terms of how we can use the video games industry as a sandbox. Many years ago, back in sort of 2002, 2003, I think it was, I met Brock Pierce for the first time, and at the time he was running IGN, which was a trading platform for black market EverQuest Gold, if you think about it. So really, I think, you can look at the way in which crypto emerged, really coming from those guys who were innovating in virtual currency back in the day. And if you look at now the sort of leaders of the crypto industry, many of them have come from video games. And in fact, there is this very interesting documentary that you guys should check out called Play Money, which really charts the development of how virtual currency was an underpinning, or at least a lot of learning happened with virtual currency as we moved into real crypto and blockchain. So I think, there's going to be other innovations that we're going to experiment with in the sandbox of games before they become more widely adopted in society. So for example, we're working on a project right now which is very focused around trying to do bot human detection. So how do you tell which is a bot? How do you tell which is a human player? Using some AI. Collision detection in games is starting to underpin a lot of the work that's going on in self-driving cars, for example. And I think, things like digital identity and the management of our own identities in broader society is really going to continue to evolve within the gaming space. Actually, the last speaker also talked a little bit about Ralph Costa. And I think, Ralph's work around things like the theory of fun and internal-external motivation is also very important. So again, as video game designers and developers, it's not just about that, the feel of the game or what have you, but we're also very adept at figuring out meta design and how to have people come back on an ongoing basis. How do we attract users in the first place? How do we engage with them? And then how do we retain them? Ultimately, how do we monetize them? And I think, obviously, Addiction by Design is quite a controversial book, but if we can create these scenarios of addiction, or at least engagement with things that are much more, useful for people, and obviously as a generation of our kids grow up, they've come to expect to be engaged and entertained with pretty much whatever they're doing, in the same way that a video game would. So I think it's very important that as, even other sectors like banking or, anything that you can really think of, it's no wonder that game developers and game designers are in demand, because we really do understand how to create this sense of engagement for a large audience. I think the next thing to note is, when you really think about it, video games, particularly massively multiplayer online games, have been dealing with large sets of analytical data for many, many years, right? I think this is an interesting quote. They're talking about the biggest barriers that companies are now facing is really just struggling with how they can cope with the amount of analytical data that is available to them. And, how do we create actionable insights that will help these companies develop? We've been doing that in the video games industry for many years now. Yeah, so basically, as I said, we really have been pioneering this collection of, analysis of, and then basing the future decisions that we make in games for a couple of decades. And I think that also is very important as you look at other areas of society and how that amount of data is now starting to be collected pretty much on everything that we do. I think also, I talked a little bit earlier about aptitude and attitude. So gamers sort of tend to absorb knowledge and adapt to new situations. We're really tenacious. When somebody puts a game in front of us, we aren't going to give up. We're going to figure out a way through. And we're really sort of strong at mentally adapting to new situations. I think if you look at typical gamers, tend to be pretty detail-oriented, tend to be problem solvers for sure, and also quite typically team players and willing to work collaboratively. I think quite frequently, people who play games are also much more comfortable with this sense of failure and trying things out, and don't get really too precious about, very much, because as you play the game, as you fail in the game, that you can start again, that you can try, and that learning and improvement really comes through that process. And I think, again, as you look at a lot of what we were talking about earlier with this whole requirement for cultural technologists, a lot of development, a lot of prototyping, a lot of, product design, as we move forward, will move so quickly that, again, we basically need people who are comfortable in that environment in order to be able to lead us through the next industrial revolution. So here's Elon Musk again. He says playing video games was how he and many of his best engineers got into programming. And I think that's also very interesting, right? So if as a culture, society, or as a jurisdiction, we don't have that video games cluster, I think as a result of that, the kids who get into STEAM-based, sort of interests are likely to move elsewhere, because I think for many, the first experience of wanting to program or sort of create things comes from that interest in video games. And so there's another reason why maintaining that video games cluster within, their local area is very important. Otherwise, those kids who have that mentality and have got that aptitude will move elsewhere, right? So I think, as it says here, if we don't maintain these creative technology hubs within our own jurisdictions, then unfortunately, the employees of the future are likely to move elsewhere. So finally, just to wrap up a little bit, I'd like to take a quick run through of some of these things that, governments and people can do to help really foster and implement the ecosystem. And, very gratifyingly and very sort of happily, we've seen a lot of this stuff already underway here in Telangana, which is pretty cool. So obviously there's the supply side, looking at talent development, looking at education, looking at investment, both internally and externally. Obviously, there's a sort of component to tax incentive. So in Canada in particular, we have a very strong series of tax incentives across the country. So for example, if you build games in Nova Scotia over on the East Coast, government will give you 50% back on the wages that you spend there. In British Columbia, we have a slightly reduced tax credit, but still very strong, and a lot of tax credits for science and innovation on the programming side as well. I think we need to look at market efficiency. So for example, this concept of smart government, where there's a kind of one-stop shop for innovation to happen, is very important. Inclusive policy building, very important. And then actually the development of physical clusters, right? So I think, what's happening here around the, the smart tower and all of these sorts of things, or the image tower, is very important, as well as, sort of access to financing and things like that. I think there's an important thing for us to all be doing around the branding of the industry in which we're in, right? So, emphasizing how the video games industry is important within this cluster is quite important. And I think things, obviously we're talking about games in healthcare and games in other sectors. So the transference of games themselves for positive social change is great. But I also think that there is this important message about, how the video games cluster itself really does breed, the innovation more generally. So finally, just 5 key levers specifically to the video games industry. One is to fund development of local content through co-investments. I know that there's a lot of activity here, and just from walking the show floor here, there's a lot of opportunity for us to be able to do co-investment. I think, foreign talent, guys from here coming to Canada, us coming over, all of these sorts of things would be very, instrumental in being able to speed up the process. And obviously that takes a government that's open to things like immigration. And again, without sounding too much like an advert for Canada, that is one of the big benefits that we have, in that we have a government that's amenable to having new people come, basically as a gateway to the whole North American market. I think it's important that, really young studios have the opportunity to fail a few times, to experiment, and to become really good at game development. You don't develop that ability overnight. So the ability to be patient with young studios is very important. And I think that means, a specific type of venture capital and government support ecosystem. And then here, I think, raising the profile of gaming is an important thing through, teams and esports and all these sorts of things is important. And then finally, I think the retention of your own IP within that cluster is also very important. So if you want to look at Canada and say, okay, well, what might we have done differently over the past 20, 30 years? I think one area is that because of the way that we'd potentially been a little bit heavy on the tax incentive side, the result of that was that we ended up in an environment which was very heavy on the work for hire services for other studios side. And I think that's getting fixed recently because we're spending a lot more time understanding the value of IP creation and retention within that cluster. So anyway, that's it from me today, and look forward to talking to you more. Thank you.